The marble was cold enough to sting her knees through the denim, and it smelled the way power always smelled in Marin's experience, like cedar polish and money and the particular silence of rooms that expected you not to exist. She pressed the microfiber cloth in slow circles against the baseboard, her headphones around her neck rather than on her ears, because she'd learned early that the building's security cameras had blind spots, and the men who reviewed the footage did not, and it was better to hear things coming than to find out about them after. The Aldrich Group's executive floor was 42 stories above Chicago's midnight, and Marin worked it every Thursday and Saturday between 11 at night and 4 in the morning, which meant she had become fluent in its geography, the way you become fluent in a language you are never supposed to speak. She knew which office had a cracked window seal that whistled in February. She knew which assistant left a protein bar in her bottom drawer every Friday that she would forget by Monday. She knew the cleaning order that kept her out of the northwest corner suite until 2 a.m., which was when the senior cleaning supervisor, Dottie, circled back to count the supply cart consumables and wouldn't notice if Marin was 4 minutes late. She knew all of it, and none of it had ever mattered, because being invisible was a skill, and Marin had spent 27 years perfecting it. She was good at disappearing inside rooms. She was good at taking up no more psychological space than the furniture, at folding her round, soft body behind the cart, at keeping her eyes on the floor where they were supposed to be. What she was not prepared for, on the second Saturday in November, was finding the northwest corner suite unlocked and dark and smelling of a man's cologne, something cold and green, like cypress in winter, and discovering that the safe behind the Gerhard painting was standing open. Marin Voss had grown up in Rockford in a house where the furnace quit in January and the electricity got cut by February, and her mother kept a coffee tin of emergency cash on the top shelf of the pantry, because banks, her mother said, were where money went to be judged. She understood safes the way she understood most things built to keep people out, by paying very close attention to the people who used them and never letting on that she was paying attention at all. She had a bachelor's degree in accounting from UIC that she'd finished in 3.5 years while working 30 hours a week at a shipping warehouse, and she had been working nights for Cold Hearts Cleaning Services for 14 months because the night differential, plus her weekend rate, got her to $1,800 a month after tax, which covered the studio in Bridgeport and the student loan minimum, and the medication she took for the anxiety that had lived in her chest since she was 9 years old, and learned that her body was considered a problem to be managed, rather than a self to be inhabited. She had applied to 3 accounting firms the previous spring, and had heard back from none of them, and had not applied again, because the silence had a particular quality she recognized, the polite institutional version of the thing people had been saying to her since middle school with their eyes, which was that she was large and therefore not quite worth full consideration. She had learned to move around this the way she moved around furniture in dark offices, which was carefully, with her hands slightly out in front of her, taking up as little space as possible. She was wearing her standard uniform, which was what she privately called her armor, black cargo pants that were 2 sizes larger than they needed to be, a loose dark gray sweatshirt that came past her hips, non-slip shoes with thick soles. Her hair was in a bun at the base of her neck, pulled tight enough that it was more statement than style. She wore no jewelry. She made herself a shape rather than a person, and the shape was the shape of someone who cleaned offices and should be ignored. And it had worked so consistently that she sometimes worried she had become the shape entirely, that there was no Marin anymore, just the cart and the cloth and the precise, careful route through other people's spaces. She stood in the doorway of the Northwest Suite for 11 seconds, she counted, before she stepped inside and pulled out her phone to call Dottie, because a safe left open in an executive suite at 2 in the morning was not a problem she was supposed to solve. It was a problem she was supposed to report and then retreat from, quickly, before whatever had caused it could decide she was part of the problem too. She was about to dial when she saw the numbers on the open laptop on the desk, and her hand went still. The screen cast the only light in the room, pale blue-white against the dark, and what it showed was a column of transactions that should not have existed. Maren was not supposed to understand what she was looking at. She was the woman with the mop. She was the cart in the peripheral vision. But she understood immediately, the way you understand a lie from someone you've watched lie before, which was that these were fractional diversions, tiny, percentage point shavings off 112 separate line items, routed to 3 Shell subsidiaries with Chicago addresses that she would bet her monthly rent were vacant lots or UPS stores. She had seen this structure exactly once before, in a forensic accounting textbook she'd borrowed from the Harold Washington Library in her second year of school, and the professor who'd written the chapter had called it ghost slicing, because it was designed to be invisible, and it would have been invisible if the numbers hadn't been organized in a way that was so precise it was almost beautiful, and Maren had never been able to look away from something beautiful, even when she absolutely should have. She took 4 photographs with her phone before she heard the elevator. The sound the door made when it opened was not loud. It was the sound of a room changing its mind about who was supposed to be in it. Maren had the phone in her cargo pocket, the safe to her left and the desk to her right, and no good explanation for any of it, and she turned to face the door the way she turned to face most things she was afraid of, which was directly, because her mother had told her once that looking away from the thing you feared gave it permission to grow, and Maren had found this to be the most consistently reliable piece of advice she had ever received. The man who walked through the door was very tall. She registered this first because the room had a 7-foot threshold, and he cleared it without thinking, which meant he was somewhere around 6'3" or 6'4", and broad in the way that read as structural rather than decorative, the kind of physical scale that suggested the body had been designed around some central load-bearing purpose. He was wearing a black suit with no tie, the jacket still buttoned, and his dark hair was slightly disordered, in a way that was the only disordered thing about him. His face was all angles, jaw, cheekbone, the sharp line where his brow dropped, and his eyes, when they found her in the laptop's blue light, were the color of obsidian glass, and they were completely still. He did not startle, he did not reach for anything. He simply looked at her the way the very still water of a very deep lake looks at the thing that has just been thrown into it, which was with a patience that was not the same thing as peace. Maren's hands were at her sides. Her heart was doing something geological. She said the only thing she could think to say, which was, "The safe was already open when I got here." The man in the black suit looked at her for a long, calibrated moment. Then he said, "I know." Ronan Aldrich had known the safe was open because he had left it open, and he had left it open because he had gotten a call from his head of security at 1:45 in the morning, informing him that someone inside his organization had been accessing his private financial records from this terminal, and he had come to the office not to catch the person doing it, but to remove the evidence before his Thursday morning board meeting, which required that certain numbers disappear, and that the men who had moved them believed they had done so without consequence. The approach was one he had used 3 times in the last 6 years, and it had worked 3 times, and it would have worked a 4th time except that the woman standing beside his desk in cargo pants and a sweatshirt the color of wet concrete was holding her phone with the particular stillness of someone who had just finished doing something with it. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was soft and round and entirely self-contained, her body filling the space between the desk and the window in a way that was somehow both still and present, and her face was doing something complicated, not guilt exactly, and not fear exactly, but the expression of someone who has already assessed the situation and reached a conclusion they don't particularly like. Her eyes were dark, very steady, and she had not moved since he walked in, which told him more than moving would have. "You took photographs," he said. It was not a question. Her chin moved a fraction upward. Of what? He walked to the desk and turned the laptop to face her and waited. She looked at the screen for exactly the amount of time required to confirm she had already seen it, which was none. "I don't know what that is," she said. "I clean offices." He pulled the chair from behind the desk and sat down in it, and crossed one ankle over the opposite knee and looked at her. He was aware that this arrangement required her to remain standing in front of him like a person called to account, and he was aware that this was unkind, and he did it anyway because he needed to see how she held herself under pressure. She held herself like someone who had been standing in front of rooms that wanted her to be smaller for a very long time, and had decided, at some point, to stop complying. Her shoulders were back, her hands were loose. She was afraid. He could see it in the faint elevation of her breathing, in the way her fingers had gone very deliberately still, but she was not going to show it beyond that, and he found this unexpectedly interesting. "The photographs," he said. She did not reach for her phone. "I'd like to call my supervisor." "Your supervisor is Dottie Kwan. She's been cleaning this building for 9 years, and she's asleep in the break room on 38. He watched her absorb this. "You have a degree in accounting." She went still in a different way than she had been still before. "I clean offices." "You do," he said. "And you hold a bachelor's degree in accounting from the University of Illinois at Chicago, graduated with a 3.8 GPA, and you applied to 3 firms last April, and none of them called you back. And you have worked for Cold Hearts Cleaning Services for 14 months. The silence in the room had a texture now, like something held between 2 palms. Her voice, when it came, was very controlled. "You ran my background check." "I run background checks on everyone in this building." "At 2 in the morning." He said nothing. She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then she said, "The thing on your screen is a ghost slicing operation. Someone inside your organization has been shaving fractional percentages off 112 line items and rerouting through 3 subsidiaries. I don't know who. I don't know how long. But whoever set it up knew your audit cycle, which means they have access to your compliance calendar." He had been still. He went more still. It was a difference you could only see if you were already watching him very closely, which she was. He said, quietly, "How much?" She said, without hesitating, "Based on what I could see, somewhere between 8 and 12 million over what looks like 22 months. He uncrossed his leg and set both feet on the floor and looked at her, and his voice, when it came, had dropped a register, low and rough and very deliberate. "What is your name?" "Maren Voss." "Maren," he said it like he was deciding something. "Delete the photographs." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression that she controlled very quickly, and then she said, "And if I don't?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Then we have a different conversation." He paused. "Delete them or give the phone to me." She reached into her pocket and he watched her hands move over the screen, and then she held the phone out so he could see the empty camera roll. He did not reach for it. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. "I have more questions." "I'd rather stand." He said nothing, just watched her with that deep, still look, and after a moment she pulled the guest chair away from the wall and sat down across from him, and the blue light of the laptop made her face look like a painting of someone who had been bracing for a long time and was very tired of it, and Ronan Aldrich, who had not found anything interesting in a very long time, felt something shift in a place he had believed no longer moved. He did not let her leave until 4:30. He asked her questions about the subsidiary structures she had identified, and she answered them with the precision of someone who had been holding the information in her head like a series of figures that needed to be balanced, not looking at the screen again, not asking him to write anything down, simply speaking in a low, careful voice about routing patterns and shell dates, and the particular type of error that was actually not an error but a message, if you knew how to read it. He watched her hands when she spoke. They moved in small, precise gestures, tracing structures in the air, and he watched her face, which was the face of someone who was genuinely interested in the problem and had, at some point in the last 40 minutes, partially forgotten to be afraid of him. She caught herself. He saw the exact moment she remembered where she was and who she was talking to, and her shoulders came back up and her hands went still, and she looked at him with that careful, defended look, and he found he disliked it intensely. When she was finished, he told her she would come back Monday night, not to clean, and that she would be paid for her time. She said, very precisely, that she would prefer to know what she was being paid to do before she agreed to do it. He said, consult. She looked at him for a moment. You have accountants. I have accountants who did not find this. He watched the slight change in her expression. Not pride, something more complicated than pride. The expression of someone who has been useful and does not quite know what to do with being seen being useful. She stood up. She pulled her cart from where it had been sitting in the hallway, and she looked at him from the doorway and she said, the safe. He looked at the painting on the wall. He walked to it and swung it aside and closed the safe with a sound like a held breath releasing, and when he turned back, she was gone, and the only evidence she had been there at all was the faint cedar and anxiety and something clean smell that had replaced his cypress cologne in the room's cold air, and the fact that every number she had told him checked out precisely when he ran them an hour later on his own system. Monday night she arrived at 7 instead of 11, because that was the time he had left with Dottie for her, and she was wearing the same cargo pants and a different shapeless dark top, and her hair in the same severe bun, and she looked at the executive suite like someone who had decided to be professional about being terrified, which he found he respected. His head of security, a man named Gavril who was built like a building and spoke mostly in vowels, brought her a temporary access badge and a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, and she held it with both hands around the cup and did not drink it for 11 minutes, which told him she needed the warmth more than the caffeine. He gave her access to the financial archive and told her she had until midnight and left her there with Gavril outside the door, and when he came back at 10:15, she had a legal pad covered in handwriting so small it looked like topography, and was staring at the screen with the particular focus of someone who has found the end of the string and is simply following it now, wherever it goes. She did not notice him for a moment. He stood in the doorway and watched her, the wide curve of her shoulders under the dark fabric, the fullness of her arms resting on the desk, the way she pressed her pen against her lower lip when she was thinking, which was the most unguarded thing he had seen her do, and he felt the thing that had shifted on Saturday's shift again. Further, in a direction that had no clean name. She looked up. She said, "It's Barros." He walked into the room. "Show me." She turned the legal pad and pointed, not to the pad but to the screen, and she walked him through it in the same low, careful voice. And what it showed was that Dimitri Barros, who was his financial director, and who had been with the Aldrich organization for 6 years, and whom Ronan had twice defended to his outer counsel as reliable, had been systematically redirecting funds to 3 accounts registered to a holding company that traced, through 4 layers of incorporation, to the Vasic family out of Milwaukee, which was not a coincidence and was not a mistake, and was the kind of thing that, in Ronan's world, had one resolution and no appeals process. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at her. She was watching him with those steady dark eyes, and she said very quietly, "I can document it completely. Every transaction, every routing number, the full trail. If you give me the right access, I can build a record that would hold up to—" She stopped. She looked at him. "Whatever standard you need it to hold up to." He understood what she was not saying, which was that she understood, more than she should, what kind of organization she was sitting inside of. He said, "Do you know what I am?" She said, "I've been cleaning this building for 14 months. He said nothing. She said, "Yes, I know what you are." The room was very quiet. He said, "And?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "And I need to know that what happens to the documentation after I give it to you doesn't come back to me." He said, "It won't," she said. "That is not a legally binding assurance." He almost smiled. It was the first time he had almost smiled in what he estimated was several months. He said, "No, it isn't." She looked at him for a moment, and then she turned back to the screen and picked up her pen, and he understood that she had decided, and he understood that this cost her something, and he found that he was aware of the cost in a way he was not usually aware of the costs other people paid. She finished the documentation at 11:47 and handed him a USB drive and a legal pad and said she was going back to Bridgeport and would not be coming back. He said, "Tuesday night, same time." She said, "I did what you needed." He said, "Barros has 2 people inside my building I haven't identified yet. I need someone who can find a financial signature without disrupting the systems while I'm looking for it." She looked at him. "You need an accountant. I need you." The words landed in the room with a weight that was not entirely professional, and he was aware of this, and he held her gaze, and she looked away first, color moving under the warm brown of her face, and she said, without looking at him, "I'll think about it." He said, "The rate is $3,000 a week." She went very still. He could see her doing the math, could see what $3,000 a week meant against the $1,800 a month she was currently earning, and he watched the calculation move through her like a tide moving through a shoreline, leaving things exposed that had been covered. She said, still not looking at him, "That's too much." He said, "It's what the work is worth." There was a pause. She said, "You don't know what the work is worth. You don't know what I can do." He said, "I know exactly what you found in 40 minutes that my team didn't find in 6 months." She said nothing. He said, "Tuesday." She picked up her bag and she walked to the door and she paused there, not quite looking back at him, and she said, "I want a contract." He said, "You'll have it." She left. Gavril materialized from somewhere in the hallway and Ronan said, without turning around, "Get me everything on Dmitry Barros. Every account, every contact, every property. Tonight," Gavril said, "and Barros himself?" Ronan looked at the legal pad on the desk and at the handwriting that was as precise and careful as everything else about Maren Voss. He said, "Not yet." He needed the second and third names first. And, though he would not have admitted this to Gavril, he needed Tuesday night to come before anything permanent happened, because something in him did not want the next several weeks to be resolved before she came back. She came back Tuesday. She came back the Tuesday after that. By the 3rd week, she had identified the second name, a mid-level operations analyst named Cressida Pell, who had been feeding transaction records to Barros for 17 months, and by the 4th week, she had found a 3rd routing pattern that pointed to someone in legal whose name she was still working on. And Ronan had begun scheduling his evenings to be in the building between 8 and midnight, which was not something he did for anyone, and which Gavril had noticed but was sensible enough not to comment on. He watched her work the way he had watched very few things in his life, which was with the kind of sustained attention that has no agenda. She worked with her left hand resting on the desk and her right hand moving the pen, and she talked through what she was doing when she was stuck, not to him specifically but to the room, which was something she clearly did when she was alone and had simply stopped policing around him, and he found this more intimate than most things people offered him deliberately. She wore the same armor every night, the shapeless clothes, the severe hair, the careful absence of ornamentation, and he had started to find the armor as interesting as what it was meant to conceal, because armor was a thing you wore because something had told you that you needed it. And the things that had told Maren Voss she needed to disappear had left marks he could read, in the way she moved through rooms, and apologized for her own volume, and pulled her sweatshirt down over her hips when she stood up, a reflex she clearly didn't know she was doing. There was the night in the 3rd week when she reached across the desk for a file, and her sweatshirt rode up, and she caught him looking, and went very still, and pulled the fabric down, and said, quickly, "Sorry," and he said, "What are you apologizing for?" And she said, in a voice that was attempting to be casual and was not. Occupational hazard. I know this isn't exactly, and she stopped and pressed her lips together, and he said, very quietly, don't. She looked at him. He said, whatever you were about to say about yourself, don't. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light of the desk lamp. He had replaced the harsh overhead fixture on the second Tuesday because it had seemed necessary, and then she looked back at the screen and said nothing, and he let it rest there, because there would be time, and he had learned that Maren Voss processed things in layers, and he could be patient. What he could not be patient about was Cressida Pell. He had removed Cressida Pell from the building the previous Friday, quietly, in the way things got removed from his organization when they had been placed there by competing interests, and Cressida Pell had not been particularly gracious about it. And on the following Wednesday she made a complaint to the building's HR contractor about an accounting irregularity she claimed to have discovered, and attached to the complaint was a description of unauthorized after-hours activity on the executive floor, and that description included, in language that was precisely calibrated to damage, the name of a night-cleaning employee who had been observed in the CFO suite without supervision on multiple occasions. The HR contractor, a woman named Belinda Okafor, who dealt primarily in the kind of institutional malice that dresses itself as compliance, called Cold Hearts Cleaning Services on Thursday morning and reported that the employee in question needed to be reassigned pending investigation. Dottie called Maren at noon. Maren did not call Ronan. He found out through Gavril, who found out because Gavril had been monitoring Pell's communications since the removal, and he was in his car on Lakeshore Drive when the call came, and he took the next exit and drove directly to Bridgeport, and he sat in his car in front of the address on her file for approximately 8 minutes before he called her. She answered on the third ring. He said, "Where are you?" She said, "Home." He said, "I'm outside." There was a pause long enough that he heard her move to a window. She said, "That's a very large car for this street." He said, "Come down." Another pause. She said, "Is this about the reassignment?" He said, "Yes." She came down in 3 minutes, still in the cargo pants, hair down for the first time. It was full and dark and fell to her shoulders, and she'd clearly been mid-task when he called because she had a pencil tucked behind one ear. And she looked at him through the passenger window with an expression that was very controlled and very tired. He leaned across and opened the door. She hesitated. He said, "Maren." She got in. She sat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it, and she smelled, up close, like cedar and something warm, like paper and a kitchen, and he thought that he had been noticing what she smelled like for 3 weeks and had been filing it under operational awareness, which was something he would need to reconsider. He said, "It was Pell." She said, "I assumed." He said, "It's handled." She looked at him. "What does handled mean?" He said, "The complaint is withdrawn. Your position at Cold Hearts is reinstated, with a formal apology from the building's HR contractor." She said, "How?" He said, "Because I own the building, and I do not accept complaints made in bad faith against members of my staff." She said, with something very dry and very controlled in her voice, "I'm not on your staff. I work for Cold Hearts." He looked at her. He said, "That's a technicality I'd like to discuss." She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the narrow Bridgeport street, at the 2 flats and the parked delivery van and the gray November sky, and she said, quietly, "Ronan." It was the first time she had used his name. He had been waiting for it, he realized, in the same way you wait for something you haven't let yourself name yet. He said nothing. She said, "I need to know what this is." He said, "The work?" She said, "All of it." He turned in his seat so that he was facing her, and he looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the fullness of her cheek, the pencil behind her ear, and he said, very quietly, "I'll tell you." But not in the car. She turned to look at him. He said, "Come upstairs." She said, "To my apartment." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough that he could feel it, and then she said, "It's very small." He said, "Marin." She said, "What?" He said, "I don't care how small it is." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she got out of the car, and he followed her. Her apartment was small the way she had said it was, and it was also the most deliberately inhabited space he had been inside in a long time. Books stacked in a system that made sense only to her. A desk buried in papers and a specific quality of organized chaos that he recognized as the workspace of someone who thought in structures. A cactus on the windowsill that was inexplicably thriving. A photograph on the wall of a woman who had Marin's jaw, and a look that suggested she had also decided, at some point, to stop complying. She stood in the middle of the room with her bag still over her shoulder and her arms crossed, not defensively but in the way someone stands when they are very tired of not knowing what is about to happen to them. He stood near the door. The room was warm, yellow-lit, nothing like his world. He said, "Barros gave a third name to Gavril this morning." She uncrossed her arms. He said, "Yevgen Kallas, his attorney." She said, "Kallas is the one who structured the holding company." "Yes. I thought it was a Chicago attorney, but I couldn't." She stopped. "Does Gavril have the incorporation documents?" He said, "Gavril has everything." She said, "Good." And then, after a pause, "Is Barros?" She stopped again. He looked at her. She looked back at him and said, very quietly, "Don't tell me. I don't need to know." He said no. She nodded, once, and put her bag down on the desk chair, and then she did something he had not expected, which was that she sat down on the edge of her couch with her hands in her lap and said, to the floor, "I've been doing the math on what I know. If it comes out that I was involved in documenting this, if Kallas has more connections than we think." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, which put them eye to eye, which was something he almost never did, and he waited until she looked at him. He said, "It won't come out." She said, "You can't guarantee." He said, "Marin." She stopped. He said, "Look at me." She looked at him. His voice dropped, rough and very quiet. "I have been in this city for 11 years, and nothing I have placed under my protection has been touched. Nothing," she said, and her voice was very careful. "I'm not yours to protect." He held her gaze. He said, "That is a technicality I am also interested in discussing." Color moved through her face again, that warm tide, and she looked at him with an expression that was something between wariness and something else, something she was not ready to name. She said, "You don't, you barely know." He said, "I know that you found in 40 minutes what 6 accountants and 3 forensic auditors couldn't find in 6 months. I know you told me to my face that the photographs were deleted when you were sitting 2 feet from a man who could have made a problem of it, and you did it anyway, because you assessed the situation and decided the photographs were less useful than the access. I know you apologized for your own arm reaching across a desk, and I know you pulled your sweatshirt down, and I know you've been making yourself invisible inside rooms for so long you've half convinced yourself there's nothing in you worth looking at." She had gone very still, he said, not quietly now, clearly, each word laid down like a fact. "There is. I see it every time you look at a screen, and every time you talk through a problem, and every time you forget to be afraid of me for 5 minutes. She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes, and there was something happening in them that she wasn't managing to contain, and he reached up and very deliberately removed the pencil from behind her ear and set it on the coffee table and said, "I want you to come work for me, formally, completely." She said, "As what?" He said, "Whatever title makes you comfortable. I'll have my attorney draft a contract tomorrow." She said, "Your attorney is Kallas." He paused. He said, "My other attorney." She almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, a small exhalation that changed the temperature of the room, and he felt it like a thing he wanted to continue. He said, "Say yes." She said, I want a salary, a title, and a desk that isn't someone else's, he said. You can have the Northwest Suite, she said. That's your office, he said. It has 2 desks. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, very quietly, Maren. Yes or no? She looked at him for a long time. This woman who had spent 14 months being invisible in his building, who had the most careful and precise mind he had encountered in a decade, who pulled her sweatshirt down over her hips when she stood, and had no idea at all that he had been cataloging her hands for 3 weeks. She said yes. He stood up from his crouch. He was very close to her now, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to hold his eyes, and he was aware of the warmth of her in the small apartment's warm air. And he said, there's one more thing. She said, what? He said, the 3rd name Barros gave us. Callis. He filed a motion this afternoon to have the documentation sealed on the grounds of attorney-client privilege. She said, he can't do that. The transactions predate his engagement letter. I know that. The privilege doesn't attach until the professional relationship. I know, Maren. She stopped. She said, so you need me to, he said, I need you to build the timeline, tonight, so that my attorneys can be in front of a judge at 7 tomorrow morning. She looked at him. She said, I'll need the full archive. He said, Gavril can have it to you in an hour. She reached behind her and picked up the legal pad from her desk and uncapped the pen that had been sitting beside it and said, I'll need coffee. He said, I'll make it. She looked up at him. He said, you have a kitchen. She said, with that dry, barely there warmth, it's very small. He said, everything here is very small, Maren, and everything here is exactly what it is, and I find that I have no complaints about either. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she turned to the legal pad and said, the archive, and the original incorporation dates for all 3 subsidiaries. He took out his phone and called Gavril, and in the small, bright kitchen he found the coffee and the filters, and in the other room, Maren Voss began to build, with the precision of someone who has always been able to see exactly what others have missed, the thing that would dismantle the last layer of what had been stealing from him. And he thought, standing at her small counter with the coffee running, that this was the most at home he had felt in a room in a very long time, and that he was going to need to decide, fairly soon, what to do about that. They were in front of the judge at 7:10. The motion to seal was denied by 7:43. Ronan's attorneys filed the full documentation package by 9, and by 10:30 the Chicago field office had opened a preliminary inquiry, and by noon, Dmitry Barros had retained a criminal defense attorney, and Cressida Pell had stopped answering her phone, and Yevgen Callis had driven himself to his attorney's office, which was deeply ironic, and Maren, who had not slept, was sitting in the passenger seat of Ronan's car on a street in the Loop, with a gas station coffee that was not good and a look on her face like someone who had just run a very long race and is deciding whether falling down is appropriate. He drove to Michigan Avenue and parked in a structure that seemed to materialize for him the way everything in his world materialized, without friction, and he said, "Come with me." She said, "I should go home." He said, "After." He took her into a building she didn't recognize, and up an elevator, and into a showroom that was warm and white and full of fabric and color. And a woman named Sylvie, who looked like she had been expecting them, materialized from behind a curtained archway and looked at Maren with the professional attention of someone who sees clothes the way Maren saw numbers. Maren said slowly, "What is this?" He said, "You start officially on Monday. You'll need appropriate clothes." She looked at him. She looked at the room, at the deep jewel colors on the racks, at the draped silks and the structured wool, and the things that were made to be worn by bodies rather than to hide them. She said, "I don't need." He said, "I know you don't need them." She said, "Ronan." He said, "Maren." She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between helpless and furious, and something else entirely. he said quietly, not looking away. You have been making yourself small for a very long time. You are done doing that for me. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sylvie. She said, Emerald and burgundy. I look good in dark colors. Sylvie smiled. Ronan said nothing, but the thing that had been shifting in him for 5 weeks settled, finally, into something solid and named, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and watched Maren Voss stop folding herself into the shape of someone who should be ignored, and he thought that there was no version of anything that came next that did not include her, and that he had known this, if he was honest, since the night she had looked at him across a blue-lit desk in a dark office and told him the exact number someone was stealing from him, and had not looked away. On the Monday she arrived at 8 in the morning in a deep emerald wrap dress that moved with the full weight of her body rather than against it, her hair down and unstructured, the pencil still there behind her ear because some things were not about to change, and she walked through the lobby of the Aldrich Group's executive building like someone who had been coming here for years and had simply decided, today, to be seen doing it. The woman at the security desk, who had seen Maren every Thursday and Saturday night for 14 months and had never once looked at her directly, looked at her now. Gavril, who was waiting at the elevator, looked at her. 3 men in suits who were crossing the lobby looked at her. She walked through all of it with her shoulders back and her stride unhurried, not performing anything, simply occupying the space her body had always deserved to occupy. And Ronan, who had been watching from the mezzanine, looked down at her and felt something in his chest that he recognized, distantly, as the thing people described when they talked about being certain, the clean, hard click of a decision that was not a decision at all, but a recognition. He came down the stairs and met her at the elevator and said nothing, and she said nothing, and they rode up to 42 in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind of silence that happens between people who have run out of reasons to pretend they are not exactly where they are. She walked into the Northwest suite, and she sat down at the second desk, which had been cleared and outfitted with a new monitor and a lamp that gave warm light rather than cold. And she opened her legal pad and uncapped her pen and said, I want to look at the Vasek family's Chicago assets. If Barros was feeding them information for 22 months, there may be holdings we haven't identified. He sat down at his own desk. He said, the third account, the one that traces to the holding company. There are 2 years of transactions I haven't been able to source. She said without looking up. Give me access and I'll have a framework by this afternoon. He said, you'll have access to everything. She looked up at him. He said, all of it. Everything in this building. Everything I have. She looked at him, and something moved through her expression that was not exactly surprise and not exactly relief, but was something older and quieter than both. The expression of someone who has been told for a very long time that they are too much, and has just been told, for the first time by someone who means it completely, that they are exactly enough. He held her gaze. He said, you close the safe from now on. She said, very quietly, that's not actually what you mean. He said, no. He paused. It isn't. She looked at him for one long moment across the space between their desks, across the amber light and the morning and the legal pad and everything that had happened in the weeks since a safe had been left open by a man who had never looked at who was cleaning his floors. And she said, then say what you mean. He looked at her, this man who gave orders in quiet rooms and never asked for anything, and he said, as simply as he had ever said anything, stay. She looked at him. She held his gaze with those steady dark eyes that missed nothing and apologized for nothing. Not anymore. And she said, I intend to. She turned back to her legal pad. He turned back to his work. Outside, Chicago was wide and cold and full of the particular gray light of November mornings, and inside the Northwest suite of the Aldrich Group on the 42nd floor, the woman who had spent 14 months being invisible in this building sat at her desk in emerald and worked, and the man who had never checked who was cleaning his floors sat at his and worked. And the safe behind the Gerhard painting was closed, and for the first time in a very long time, everything in that room was exactly where it was supposed to be. If Marin's story hit you the way it hit me, hit that like button because it genuinely helps this channel more than you might think. Share this one with someone who needs to hear that being the person no one looks at sometimes means you're the only one who sees everything. And subscribe if you want more stories where the most dangerous thing in the room turns out to be the woman everyone underestimated. Drop a comment and tell me which moment got you, because I read every single one.